I'm yeah. Uh, I
see.
was on with a talk about Viking women recently, and it occurs to me this ain't no kind of a Viking woman. It's not a Viking culture anymore. It's 700 years different, I understand. But it seems to me that that's an awful lot of change in even 700 years. Is there's no tradition of the value of women over that time? How did it get lost?
Well, let me tell you a few interesting things. So between the Viking period and 1879, Norway goes through a very serious economic decline. Part of this is triggered by the plague that sweeps through in like the 16th, 17th century, and something like more than a third of the country died. Many of the upland areas emptied out, and farms were abandoned. Um, I have a good friend from Minnesota whose name is Mark Odegaard, and he told me once that Odegaard means empty farm, abandoned farm. And there are quite a few Odegaards that I've run across in my work. So that had this depressing effect on the country. It also was sucked into the Danish, and the Danes and the Swedes were much stronger at that time, and Norway was sort of bounced back and forth between them as a poor province. So Norway goes into this decline after the Middle Ages, and it doesn't really recover very well until the 19th century. It does begin to recover then. They had potatoes and they had the herring run. They suffer the same kind of potato famine that Ireland suffers, but because they have the herring run, they're not, both things do not fail at the same time. So it's not as cataclysmic. It's still bad, and there's a lot of poverty and a lot of hunger, and it is part of what feeds the migration, obviously. But it's hard to make money off a farm in Norway. There, it's high latitude and often high altitude and short growing season and everything. So the country struggled to regain the kind of wealth it had during the Viking period. It was also treated quite poorly in European politics, I would say, and they had to fight for their freedom in the mid 19th century. I mean, I'm not technically, they did not go to war, but they pushed very hard to be made their own country again, and in fact even adopted their own constitution before they actually were a separate country. So I think at that point they adopted, there were sort of two classes. There was the farmer class, and there was this bureaucratic class that was often had been trained outside of Norway, in Denmark often, or Sweden, and who almost like a class made of foreign service officers, who had lived around the world and really were not that much in touch with the local population. Of course, in the 19th century, what emerges is a middle class of artisans and people who were somewhat better educated. Now, the Norwegians had always educated people up to about age 13. And I had several Norwegian historians tell me that was kind of unusual. A lot of the immigrants to America came over illiterate, but not the Norwegians. Most of them could read, and yet very few had gone into higher education. So it's funny, when you think of Norway's history, this period after the plague of about 400 years is one of just mired in poverty mostly. And it takes them a long time.
And I could see where, since the men are staying then on the farms and at most going out fishing, which takes at most a couple of weeks at most,
sure.
They're going to be home to man the things, and they're going to want to be in charge. Forgive me, gentlemen.
Although, Cece, I would say
have to.
I would say, Cece, that in the farm economy, women were very valuable. And so one of the things so interesting with the Victorian era is somehow society manages to completely disarm women so that all they are objects and and baby producers. And I wanted to show in my book, I wanted to so spoiler alert here, this is the only spoiler I'll give, but Nora does immigrate to America in the middle of my book. When Nora gets to the American prairie, she suddenly becomes part of a farm family economy. And for the first time, she feels like she has a real purpose in the world. So I thought that was interesting that you would have to almost send her back in time and make her poor to make her valuable. So yeah, so it was the Victorian bourgeois class, the women were in a very odd position. And honestly, they didn't stay there for that many generations. They began to break out. So does that answer your
Which is
question?
why we say Victorian.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Sonia?
What percentage of the population was bourgeois?
Oh, that's a very good question, Sonia. And I don't know the answer to it, except it was small. It was, truly bourgeois, it was probably less than 10%. But there was sort of this artisan class, especially by the middle of the 19th century. And one of the characters I introduce in the book is a man who is a carver from the Lillehammer area, and which is famous for its carvers. And he grew up on a farm that his older brother inherited. So he did not really have a living other than carving. And as the farm as the farm produces less, he has less opportunity. So he immigrates to America as well. But he was, I tried to make him sort of typical of that group. He was apprenticed as a carver, and so he got a little bit more education in an apprentice position. In fact, Ibsen was apprenticed to a pharmacist when he was a young man and got more education that way as well. So
I actually visited the pharmacy that he worked in because it was a town right near where my father grew up.
wow, that's very
I think
interesting.
he was about 17 or so when he went to a place called Grimstad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little museum now.
Yeah, I didn't get to that one, but I knew of its existence. That's very cool.
And then I think after he was there, I could never find out what happened to him during I think about 3 years he was there. But he left, I think he left Norway after that. And my understanding was he's pretty.
No, he doesn't leave Norway until later. He goes to Christiania because he tries to matriculate at the university, but he can never pass the exams. He's very poor as a poor student at that time. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Nora ends up living in the neighborhood of Vika, which is right down on the harbor, sort of a slum of Christiania at the time. And I put her rooming house, she ends up living in a rooming house of other university students, which was based on Ibsen's experience in a small rooming house in Vika at that time. So yeah, he actually has a child by a servant in Grimstad.
So, I wondered about that.
Yeah, that's a whole nother controversy.
But being a bourgeois was, they were always worried about losing their status.
Yes. Especially someone like Ibsen. So he ends up, after he is a very poor university student, he starts writing plays and they start to get some attention. And he ends up being hired as a sort of resident playwright at the theater in Bergen. And so he moves to Bergen and he manages the theater and he writes plays there. None of those plays are really great. I don't think he writes Peer Gynt there, but he may towards the end. Anyway, that's where he meets his wife, Susanna, and he gets sort of pulled into the bourgeois class that way, sort of through his intellect, basically, and his talent. So that's how he clambers out, but doesn't really feel that secure in it for a long time in his life.
How many years does he live abroad? And when does
quite a few. In fact, he writes Nora abroad, and he said that he had to get out. He lived abroad because, as the way he put it was, he was tired of living up a foggy fjord. And that was a metaphor for him of what the society was like around him. So he always said he could never have written Doll's House if he had been in Norway at the time.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Okay, let's go on to the second part.
So as I said in the